Have you been to many funerals? Maybe family members, close friends. I've been to plenty over the years and they're never fun. The grief, the loss, the emptiness, the confusion. The closer you are to the person who's died, the worse it is. But the harsh reality is that until Jesus returns, death is a part of life, even for Christians. Ecclesiastes 7 even says that there's benefit for us to go to funerals, because in funerals we recognise how fragile life is. Ecclesiastes 7 verse 2 says, "It's better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting. For death is the destiny of every man. The living should take this to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, because a sad face is good for the heart." Just because we trust God, it doesn't mean that we can escape suffering, or frustration, or sin, or death. And we can't control any of that, or escape it, despite our medical science, our technology, our wealth. That is the grim reality of living in a fallen world. Funerals are good reminders of that. They teach us humility and perspective. And even if we're not experiencing suffering yet, funerals prepare us, because these things will happen. Funerals encourage us to trust God as we go through trials and suffering. Now, it's a similar lesson, I think, here in this first chapter of 2 Samuel, as we watch David's reaction to the death of his great enemy, King Saul, and his great friend, Jonathan. We come face to face with death and David's genuine grief. It's uncomfortable, it's unsettling, it's awkward, but it's life. This is someone that God is working in and through. This is someone that God has made great promises to, and yet even he doesn't escape pain and loss. So let me invite you, come and learn how to grieve in a godly way. Come and learn what a life of faith looks like in a broken world. Before we jump into 2 Samuel, let's set some context. It's the first chapter of the book, sure, but don't forget 2 Samuel is actually the sequel. The story has continued from 1 Samuel. And together, 1 and 2 Samuel, they're a story about how Israel wanted a king like the nations, someone that they could trust in, someone who would rule them and lead them against their enemies. That's 1 Samuel chapter 8. And even though that was God's job, God gave them Saul. Saul starts strongly. He boldly rescues the city of Jabesh-Gilead from the Ammonites, but it doesn't last long. Next, he prepares to fight the Philistines. Verse 13, the prophet Samuel says he's to wait until Samuel arrives before he offers sacrifices, but Saul decides to offer sacrifices himself. And so God takes the kingship away from Saul and promises to appoint instead a man after his own heart. Then in chapter 15, Saul fights Amalekites. Samuel had told him to completely destroy all the Amalekites, men, women, children, cattle and sheep. Saul wins the battle, he destroys all the people, but he keeps the best of the animals for himself. And the word of the Lord comes to Samuel, "I'm grieved that I've made Saul king, because he's turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions." In chapter 16, we're introduced to David, the youngest and smallest of Jesse's sons. God leads Samuel to him, and then Samuel anoints David king to replace Saul. And then the rest of 1 Samuel describes Saul and David's tense relationship. David kills the giant Philistine Goliath for Saul in chapter 17. And in chapter 18, he becomes best friends with Saul's son Jonathan and marries Saul's daughter Michal. Chapters 19 to 28 describe how Saul tries to kill David to remove the competition. David hides and even flees and lives among the Philistines, his great enemies. And twice David has the opportunity to kill Saul, but he says he refuses to take the life of God's anointed king. In chapter 30, David and his army pursue the Amalekites. They've raided his home city and captured his family. He defeats the Amalekites and he recovers his family and all his possessions. Finally, 1 Samuel finishes in chapter 13. Saul and Jonathan fight the Philistines at Mount Gilboa. The Israel army is defeated. Saul is severely wounded. Jonathan is killed. And Saul's armour bearer refuses to kill Saul. And so Saul falls on his sword and dies. The Philistines cut off his head and hang his body from the walls of their city, Bethshan. The very last scene of the book describes how the people of Jabesh Gilead, out of their loyalty to Saul, risked their lives to take his body down from the wall back to their city where they bury it. All right, that was a quick summary of the whole book of 1 Samuel. It brings us to the start of 2 Samuel. The king is dead. And now we watch how God's next choice for king will react to this news. In lots of ways, chapter 1 looks forward. It looks to how David will begin to build support for his claim to be king, but it also looks back. And there are lots of references to events that have already happened in 1 Samuel. And the more we can understand this backstory, the better we can understand what's actually happening here. So, for example, look at verse 1 of 2 Samuel, chapter 1. After the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. Now, it's the Amalekites that Saul defeats but doesn't completely destroy, even though God has commanded it. And it's the Amalekites, they're the reason, more than anything else, for why Saul has the kingship removed from him. In fact, the night before his death to the Philistines, God says to Saul that his death will come because he didn't fully obey God in destroying the Amalekites. And so here, in this very first verse, by comparison, verse 1 tells us that David has defeated the Amalekites. What better credentials for someone to replace Saul? So David's returned home victorious. He knows there's been a battle between Saul and the Philistines, but he doesn't know the outcome. And so we have this awkward 2-day wait for news. 2 days until an Amalekite arrives with a story to tell. Verse 2, this young man turns up, his clothes are torn, he's covered in dust. He's travelled what I worked out was about 150 kilometres from Jezreel, where the Israelites were camped, near Mount Gilboa, where they were defeated, down to Ziklag, where David is. David wants to know the details of the battle. And the man replies, verse 4, the men fled from the battle, many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. It's the news David had dreaded, but he wants more details. How do you know they're dead? Verse 6, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, the young man said, and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and riders almost upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, what can I do? He asked me, who are you? An Amalekite, I answered. At this piece of information, Saul apparently asks him to kill him because he's too badly injured to recover. And the man concludes, verse 10, so I stood over him and killed him because I knew that after he'd fallen he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and have brought them here to my Lord. Now, for those of us who've just finished reading chapter 31 of 1 Samuel, this is quite a different story to what we've just read. It's Saul's armour-bearer who's with him, and he actually refuses to kill the king. And so Saul takes his own life. And so we're wondering, well, what actually is the truth here? But there's enough of the truth that this young man is giving to make his lie convincing. Plus he's got the proof. He presents the crown and the armband. So the question is, how will David react? The Amalekite thinks he's bringing good news. He hopes that David will reward him, not just for killing Saul, but for bringing him the crown that he will wear as king. But for David and his men, this is terrible news. Verse 11, then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan and for the army of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they'd fallen by the sword. Just imagine it all day, just distraught with the tragedy of it. At some point during the day, though, David's attention turns to the one who's delivered this bad news and who, by his own admission, is responsible for it. Verse 13. David said to the young man who brought the report, "Where are you from?" "I'm the son of an alien, an Amalekite," he answered. David asked him, "Why were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" One piece of information David already knows: he's an Amalekite, which should be enough to make David suspicious, considering his recent history with Amalekites. The second piece of information is new, though. He is the son of an alien. In other words, he and his parents are immigrants living in Israel. Now, that might explain what he's actually doing around Mount Gilboa. Perhaps he's been serving in Saul's army, a conscript. It might explain how he knows about David, that David is a contender for the throne, and how he might be interested in Saul's crown and the news of his death. He may have thought offering this information that he was an immigrant in Israel would actually help his cause, show him to be an ally. But for David, there's a greater significance in that piece of information. He should know enough about Israel's God and about Israel's king to be afraid to kill the Lord's anointed. And so he sentences him to death. Verse 15. He's been proved guilty by his own words, "I killed the Lord's anointed." Now, I don't know how you feel about that. Maybe slightly uneasy about the justice of this, since the man probably didn't actually do it. But as far as David knew, by the man's own words, he was guilty. I suspect, though, that's not the main point of this bit of the story, though. I suspect the main point is it shows the importance that David gives to the role of the king. How he will defend the office of the king, even if it's in Saul's death. He will stand up for God's king. The next section, from verse 17, it returns to this theme of David's grief. It's been described for us as an outsider, but this time it's told in poetry from David himself. Songs, they have a way of expressing emotions, don't they, in a way that words on their own can't. To compose and sing a lament for himself, that's one thing. But do you notice what David does? He does more than that. Look at verse 18. He commands the men of Judah to learn the song as well. This is too sad an event for David just to mourn by himself. It's fitting that all of Judah mourn with him. There is something comforting, isn't there, about people mourning with you. Sometimes we go to a funeral of someone that we've never even met, but we go to support the person who is grieving, the person who's been left behind. We go to support them. Romans 12:15 encourages us to rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. You see, a joy that is shared is a joy that's doubled. And a sorrow that's shared is a sorrow halved. I think there's some truth in that. But there's another reason David wants this song publicised. There's a political reason, I think. He wants to reassure all of Saul's supporters that his hands are clean. He's not to blame for Saul's death in any way. And so now they can transfer their support to him as he establishes himself as king. Now, you might think that I'm being slightly cynical there. You might think David's more pure than that. But people are complicated, aren't they? Motives are mixed. All of us have mixed motives. All of us are a combination of good and bad, of wrong and right, and David is no exception. We'll see this again and again as we work through 2 Samuel. This is great literature. It's subtle. It doesn't give us simple answers about what we should do and what we shouldn't do and what's wrong and what's right. Actions can be interpreted in more than one way. And so we're going to be encouraged to read the stories carefully, to take notice of things, to reserve judgment. So what do we notice about David's lament? Verse 19, it is David's lament, it's his loss, but this is a song for Israel. Saul was their king, Jonathan was their prince. And so this first verse addresses Israel. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on the heights. How the mighty have fallen. Your glory, it could refer to Saul or to Jonathan or to them both. It could even refer to the whole army. How the mighty have fallen. It would be a good title for this song. It's a chorus that is repeated 3 times. Verse 19, verse 25, verse 27. How the mighty have fallen. It's meant for all Israel, but it really is about David's grief and him trying to process it and express it and quantify it. So verse 20, it's such terrible news. David says there should be a media ban among the Philistines. This would just break my heart to hear the daughters of the Philistines rejoicing at this news. It'll break my heart to hear them insulting Saul's memory. Verse 21, it's such terrible news, let the place of death be cursed. It's fitting that there be a drought on this mountain. It's fitting that the mountains should mourn, that the lack of life will be an enduring reminder of the lives that were lost in this place. It just seems wrong that life go on as normal, as if nothing's happened. Reminds me of W.H. Auden gut-wrenching poem about death, Funeral Blues. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone, silence the pianos, and with muffled drum bring out the coffin, let the mourners come. Let aeroplanes circle, moaning overhead, scribbling on the sky the message, he is dead. This death is so tragic. Everything, living and non-living, everything should join in mourning along with me. Why is their death such a tragedy? Verse 23, Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and gracious, in death they were not parted, swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. If you've read 1 Samuel, you might wonder about how accurate those words are. But now's not the time for pointing out failures and faults. At their best, father and son were united. At their best, they were respected and loved. And so verse 24, it's appropriate that David calls on the daughters of Israel to join with him, to weep for Saul. This contrasts with the daughters of the Philistines who are cheering. The daughters of Israel should weep because Saul has won the nation great victories and he's brought prosperity. But it's in verse 25 to 27 that we really get to the heart of David's grief. It's at its most heartbreaking, isn't it? He describes his relationship with Jonathan. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. Do you notice at the start of the song, it's Israel's glory lies slain on the heights? And we wondered who it was referring to. Well, now we see what David thinks is Israel's glory. It's Jonathan. He names it. Jonathan lies slain. Verse 26 gets more personal. For the first time, David moves from talking about Jonathan to speaking to him. As we read 1 Samuel, we know that this is a deeply personal friendship. But it's also a public friendship in a sense, because Jonathan is the crown prince. He's next in line for the throne, but David is God's anointed, who's been chosen for the throne to succeed Saul. And Jonathan publicly recognises David as the next king, as his king. And so when David calls Jonathan my brother, it captures something of the private, captures something of the public relationship. And we're going to see what it means for Jonathan to be his brother. We're going to see, as we keep reading 2 Samuel, how David shows kindness to Jonathan's descendants for the sake of Jonathan. And the song finishes with the repeated chorus, how the mighty have fallen. So that's the song. What can we learn from it? The first thing to recognise is that God has given us this song. Did you notice it's a song that has no mention of God? It's a song that expresses both extreme grief and deep love. The Bible, overwhelmingly, is about God. It's a spiritual book. It's about our relationship with Him. It's about eternity and sin and redemption, and that's fantastic. But God has also made us human. He's made us to laugh and to weep. He's made us to experience death and birth, loss and blessing, love and grief. Being human is so important to God that He sent His Son to earth and wrapped Him in human flesh. And Jesus lived, and He loved, and He lost. Jesus laughed and He wept, just like His ancestor David. So what can we learn from David about how we should grieve in death? Well, firstly, we can grieve with thankfulness. We see it in David's example, don't we? Everything comes from God. Everything that was good about the person that we loved who's now died, everything is the result of God's work in their life. We can give thanks for that. Every good experience that we had with that person we've lost was because of God's providence. We can grieve with thankfulness. Grieving at death is a blessing, says Ecclesiastes, because it gives us the opportunity to thank God. Secondly, we can grieve with hope. We can grieve with hope. Paul writes to the Thessalonian Christians in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, "Brothers, we do not want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep, or to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope." We believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who've fallen asleep in Him. Christians will grieve. Death is horrific, and we've lost someone that we love. But if they're in Christ, then we're confident that death has been beaten. And for someone who dies trusting Jesus, our separation from them, it's only temporary. We'll see them again. And it's all because of the foundation of Jesus' resurrection. It's not so clear here in 2 Samuel 1, but David did know something of God's faithfulness beyond death. A few pages further on in chapter 12, David has prayed for God to spare his newborn son, the result of his adultery with Bathsheba. But the son dies. And so David, he stops fasting and weeping. He goes home, he washes, he eats, he goes to the temple to worship God. His servants can't understand it, and they ask him what he's doing, and he answers, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he's dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." He doesn't understand all the details, but he knows that he has a confident hope as he faces death, that death is not the end. And I wonder if you noticed a hint of that here in 2 Samuel chapter 1. I don't know, see what you think. I tried this on Thursday night at Bible study. I don't think they were convinced particularly, but see if you notice it. Verse 1, we've got a king who dies on a mountain in Israel. And then there's a 2-day wait. And then bad news arrives from an eyewitness about death. But 3,000 years later, another king dies on a hill in Israel, on Golgotha. And 2 days later, news arrives from eyewitnesses. But rather than bad news of death, it's good news of life, of death defeated, of sorrow turned to laughter. We can see it. I don't think that the author of 2 Samuel was aware of what he was saying, but we can see echoes, we can see patterns. Those of us who know of the resurrection of Jesus can rejoice in it as we see this little echo here. For those of us who follow Jesus, death no longer stings. We grieve. We will continue to grieve at death until he returns, but we can grieve with hope. We can grieve with thankfulness. It's better to go to a house of mourning than a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of every man. The living should take this to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, because a sad face is good for the heart. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are interested in every part of our life. We thank you that you grieve at death more than we do. We thank you that you didn't just leave the world the way it was, but you sent Jesus to deal with death. We rejoice in that. For those of us who grieve at the loss of people, might we grieve with thankfulness, might we grieve with hope, and might we trust in Jesus who defeats death. We pray it in his name. Amen.